tells you how hard it is to be original. Sometimes you have a great idea and you go onto the web and you find that, oh shit, all right? Somebody else already had that idea. Robert Merton wrote this book 50 years ago about kind of the sociological problem of originality, how it's one of these things we fetishize it and we give it a sort of ritual obeisance, but when you start to burrow in, it turns out to be really slippery and hard. And there's this great anecdote in the book, I've never seen it sourced anywhere, and Merton was the kind of guy, he didn't have to source things, but he said that Freud never read Nietzsche because Freud, was afraid that he would find some of his ideas in Nietzsche. And to sort of think about the era in which they lived and who they were, it's quite a remarkable thing if it's true. So punctual is the first. Second is pithy. Getting to your point in the second or the third graph maximum. No later. All right? The paper that publishes me the most is my hometown paper, the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's a paper that has seen some struggles, and it's cut way back in its staff. So much so that now one of the editors told me that the Philadelphia Inquirer, not a big metropolitan daily, they still get about 200 op-ed submissions a day, 1,000 a week, and mostly they're reading the first graph, again, to see if you can get into that gate, right? And if the first graph says, scholars have long debated, ... you're not getting into the gate. Look, I'm a scholar, I don't give a shit about that, right? Imagine somebody who wasn't. Scholars have long debated. Boy, right? No. So, pithy, and then finally persistent, and this gets back to the rejection thing. If somebody says no, and they will, over and over again, you send it to somebody else. Once you've done this for a while, you do get a sense of what the tastes are of the different people that edit the pages, and kind of their aesthetic and even their politics, and so it does get a little easier. And then in terms of how you actually do it, make the opening snappy. Remember that there's somebody on the other end who's only reading the leads, right? So you've got to get into that gate. How do you do it? I do it in all kinds of different ways. So personal experience, right? If you're writing about an education thing, you can say, well, I was teaching a class the other day and X happened. They'll keep reading. Definitely. Because they want to know what happened. And they're like, hey, this person is a teacher or a professor, right? A quiz, that works really well. It moves the eye along. You might think it's a little sleazy. I don't. If it gets people reading. Which of these four things happened last week? Or here's a quote and who said it? A, B, C. Or just, generally a quote from the news. That works well too. All right? Here's what this politician said on Thursday. Is it true? I think, Mark was referring to the data or the academic study. Usually for that, it's historical. You do have to keep it brief. I generally will restrict myself to about 3 graphs of history. And a couple other things. Try to make your point prescriptive. That is, urge people to do something, even if it's just to reconsider the issue. The best way to get into print is to ask people to do something. So Congress should do this, the city council should do this, the school board should do this, or even the voters should do this. Your chances are better if you make your point relate to your published work or your academic job. It doesn't mean that every op-ed has to have that, but again, we're talking about odds here. Okay, so if the point you're making is in some ways related to what you're writing, and in the slug, which is journalese for your ID at the bottom, it says, Jonathan Zimmerman has written this book about history instruction, right? If the column is about history instruction, your chances are better. And what I do, of course, is I play with my slug, right? I've written a bunch of different books, and I'll put a different book in there depending on the topic that I'm writing about. And then try, if you can, to return to your main point at the end. Sometimes op-eds fail because they have a really interesting point, but then they go off into academic land and they don't really come back to the point or to the news. And I think the most successful ones are the ones that begin with the news, then have an academic discussion that's well translated, and then come back to the news at the end, come back to the point. If you have a chance to look at the handout later on, I just gave you a couple examples. The first 4 pieces I gave you were pieces that came out of my first 4 books. My first book was about, believe it or not, the history of alcohol and alcohol education, and so that one generated a piece that you'll see about current controversy about drug education. I wrote a book about history instruction, and I used that to write about teaching history in Iraq. I wrote a book about teachers overseas, so I did one about U.S. teacher training and comparing that to teacher training in other parts of the world. My last book was about the cultural memory of the Little Red Schoolhouse, so when there was the shooting at the Amish one-room school, I wrote about that. But I want to emphasize that you don't have to write about some book you're writing. I think that college professors often don't actually know how much they know. About all kinds of things. And you have spent a huge part of your life educating yourself and teaching yourself about a huge number of things that aren't necessarily captured in your book, but they're things you teach and write and think about. Other examples that you'll see, I wrote a piece about the college press. I was a college newspaper editor, one of the things that troubles me is that the college newspaper, at least where I am, treats the administration with kid gloves, and I find this outrageous, because actually the student paper is the only place you can get credible information about your institution. You could read, at NYU there are 2 of them, I call them TASS and Pravda. And they have their place. I understand where they're coming from. I'm actually very good friends with the editor of one of them. But, I guess I'm old enough to think that the job of the student paper is just to give shit to the administration. Nobody else is going to. I wrote one about college dorms. And again, because I'm a university professor, they'll look into this. Why are the college dorms so nice? If you look at places like Harvard Yard, you'll see that their architecture was designed to seal out the world. It's not that the people were living in poverty, but there was a monastic aesthetic to them, right? And if you go to Cambridge, you'll see that. And one of the points that I try to make in that piece is that's completely gone away, and we're trying to make these incredibly nice and swishy. You'll see another piece in there about presidents and how rich and poor they are. Like Mark, I really get annoyed in the paper where I open up the paper and it says, today all the people running for president are really rich. It's not like the old days where kind of anyone could become president. Please, that's the kind of thing. Again, am I an expert on presidential history? Certainly not. In fact, when I trained in U.S. history, you learned all about French mill workers and nothing about Congress or the White House. We go to seminars where we talk all about power here and power that, power on the shop floor, power in the classroom, power in the bedroom. It's like, didn't I read that Congress makes laws? Like, that's power, I think, right? I didn't learn any of that in grad school, but I learned it as a teacher. And I learned it in the course, actually, of, writing op-ed. So I hope you'll do the same. Thanks.